On today's show, we're going to talk about some practical ways that churches can incorporate video games within their church services, youth services, and just any sort of community outreach. All coming at you next. What's up, everybody? I'm Russ Dornisch, and welcome to CrossFire Faith and Gaming Podcast. And joining me today, as always, are my co-host, the Reverend David Petty.
Hey, what's up?
And, of course, our wonderful friend and co-host, Brian.
Hey there.
So, as I said in the intro, today we are going to be covering a question that we decided to discuss and go over, which was, what are some practical ways that churches can incorporate video games into their youth, young adult ministries, church services, whatever that may be? Of course, Crossfire Faith and Gaming Podcast and Crossfire Faith and Gaming Community is a cross-section between faith and gaming. So the question is, how can others do something similar to what we're doing and connect with people that they may not connect with normally, and that being the gaming community as a broader whole? So a couple questions. Let's just start off with, what are your guys' thoughts on some practical ways that churches can connect with gamers and connect kind of the church and faith with the idea of religion? David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think first, before we even jump into the question of connecting with gamers, I think there's a question of like why, right? Like why gamers? And to me, that question has always been answered with gamers are often people who, first off, there's the certain social stigma there. I mean, there's lots of other groups you could pull out that have social stigma. This just happens to be one I'm a part of. But there's some social stigma with gamers. I also feel like geeks and gamers and nerds have often been alienated from groups and especially the church. And so, I think the question is like, how do we re-engage those people who might otherwise feel alienated from the church? So that's kind of the beginning of why, before you even get to the what.
And Brian, what do you say then if we're looking at the what do you think is the why?
Yeah, I think also, in today's society, I think it's different than like when we were all kids, right? There's just a lot more engagement with video games. I know when I was young, it was a little bit unusual to be into kind of geek media, and that seems like it's really, really changed, right? And so I think, if you are someone who's in youth ministry now, it's just like every kid is into what we would think of as kind of geek media, and that includes video games. There's just a broad interest now in video games, and I think there's also some things we'll talk about later too, in terms of like video games have embraced a kind of wider interest as well, to be more inclusive to a lot of different kinds of people. So I think that's my perspective on, why we should engage. It has a lot to do with, that if you want to engage with kids, this is an area of interest that they're almost all going to have.
Yeah, for me, I agree. Like we obviously, if you're in the church, if you're in ministry, I think the big thing that churches can sometimes make the mistakes of is think that, okay, we need to have people conform to the way that we want things to be, rather than us conforming to the way that others and society are currently being. And like I think you said, Brian, nerd culture has drastically evolved over the last 20 to 30 years. You go back and you think of nerd culture back in the 80s and 90s, and it was seen as this like, nerdy people are losers almost. They're not people that are accepted by society, and they're weird and they don't conform to the normal things that people want. And now it's almost popular to kind of follow in with that nerd culture. Anime is such a huge driver now in culture across both adults and young people. Video games, obviously, much more mainstream thing. You know, comics and all that, obviously, with Marvel and the explosion of that kind of culture has really just changed that. And so that's where we're at today. And so I think the biggest reason for us to explore this idea, and part of the reason that we have this group in the first place, is we need to adapt to the way that culture is today. And that adaptation comes in the form of, okay, well, nerd culture is now mainstream and it's a very important thing. How can we connect with those people in a practical way that tells them and shows them that, hey, you can still be a part of this thing and still have this. And, you know, maybe the message that was sent out maybe 20, 30 years ago by the church where, you know, they also thought that media and just different things were not cohesive or, you know, something that was applicable to church, religion, the Bible, all that stuff. So I definitely think that that's probably the biggest thing I see is the ability to adapt and really connect with those people on a different level. So when it comes to practical ways that the churches can incorporate video games into youth, young adult ministries, church services, what are your guys' thoughts? David, being the pastor, what are your thoughts if you were to involve that a little bit more in church in general that you have going on?
Yeah, well, I think the fundamental place to start is to recognize that the function of video games and media is cultural storytelling. Right, and I think for generations, you know, the stories of our people were the stories of the Bible, and I think for a lot of people nowadays, the stories of our people are found more in Marvel, or they're found in Disney, or they're found in Star Wars, or you know, things like that. Of course, I only named Disney properties just now, but you know, the stories of our people, like they're found in pop culture. And so I think to recognize that and then to say, okay, if we're going to tell the story of who we are as it relates to our spiritual nature, as it relates to the divine, we also need to use language that talks through the lens of the stories of our people, right? So if we can't relate to people through stories like Disney and Marvel and, you know, DC Comics, or through, you know, video game characters, then I think there's a missed opportunity there. And people might just default back to only the stories that they think of through pop culture rather than recognizing some of the deeper spiritual truths there. So I think one of the ways to do it is to connect those two lenses, connect the stories of our people through pop culture and the stories that we know and love from Scripture.
Ryan, what are your thoughts on ways that you could see that? You know, you have a teenage son who goes to youth group. You know, what are ways you would like to see youth pastors, youth ministries, churches be able to connect with people using the media that is video games?
Yeah, and I think here what I want to point out is, like, if you are in youth ministry and maybe you're not super into video games, it could be that just like you might mostly identify a certain kind of video game, like you might be familiar with like shooters or other kind of the more violent side of video games, but that video games have changed a lot over the last couple decades, and odds are that there's a place for you to engage that maybe you haven't found yet. So there's Minecraft, there's Stardew Valley, there's Animal Crossing, there's many, like, cozy games is a thing now, like a really engaging category that we're seeing a lot more games.
Stardew Valley, you know, unpacking.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more games in those kind of categories that are like, oh, if I'm not like sort of a core gamer, that's probably what we would call someone who's into like Call of Duty and like Overwatch and a number of other shooters, right? You might not be into those things, but there's probably places where you can engage, places where you can get plugged in, games that you can get involved in, that give you like the ability to connect with someone else. It gives you a conversation topic and a place to start from of like, yeah, I'm into games. I play, even if I play Bejeweled or whatever, I play phone games. Like, you've got a place to start your engagement from in terms of building that common ground. And then also, as we talked about earlier, this idea of like, hey, I can start thinking about the ways that games and scripture and the way that we can tie those together. So, I think it's just what I really want to say is like, hey, if you think that you're not into games, it might just be that you haven't found the right kind of games yet.
Yeah, I have a conversation with a lot of people when they find out I play video games, and I throw that question back on them of like, well, are you sure you don't play any games at all? Like, they don't have to be just the video games that I think of, and my wife has even brought that point up too. Like, I've had to remind her, she's like, yeah, I'm not a gamer. And I'm like, actually, you are. You spend a lot of time playing Candy Crush in your downtime. Like, that counts. That's a video game. That counts on your cell phone. So we all have those type of games and things that we can find. And, we had that conversation off the podcast with board games as well, and D&D. There's so many options for people. The way I look at this and what I think are practical ways that churches should be incorporating this, I look at some of the successful things that I've seen from some larger churches, from some more mainstream churches. Some of the best sermon series are ones that connect with people in a more realistic type of way, where we do kind of compare and contrast it and bring in the example of present day media. My wife this summer did an entire Summer at the Movies sermon series where we looked at summer blockbusters and how they relate to certain stories in the Bible. And it's really easy to take that and connect with people on a different level. And she did. She got a lot of comments from some younger people who reached out, some, people in their 20s, 30s that were like, I never thought of it this way. It was really cool to see that, and I was really engaged, and it really grabbed me, and I wanted to listen to it rather than kind of zoning out like I may normally do, which, happens on occasion. But the same thing could be said if you bring that in as far as video games. So doing youth series on video games, sermon series on video games, devotionals, Bible studies, there's so many different ways that we can then connect that to video games, include that. For any of you youth pastors out there, if you wanted to do like a cool little fun video game series for a little bit before you did a movie series or an anime series eventually, like you want to obviously differ and variations of your kind of studies because you have different people who have different likes. But even then, you'll find that people find it fun to, show up youth group, have a game associated with that. Maybe you have a video game that you pull out and have everybody at youth group play, and then you guys talk about it through a devotion or Bible study. So I think that's a really great thing. Now, switching gears with this. So if we take all our ideas and we kind of conversate and figure that out, the next question I have, which I know comes up quite frequently, and we've gotten it a bunch, which is, so how do churches then navigate potential concerns or objections from older members who may not be familiar with or comfortable with gaming culture? We know they're out there. We know we've experienced them one way or another. They're stuck in their ways. They're usually, fairly traditional. They don't like change. So how do we kind of navigate that and figure out, okay, how to deal with concerns of older people? David, as a pastor, I know that you deal with this on a daily basis. So what do you think are ways that we could do that when it comes to video games?
I mean, I think for one, it's to make it relatable. For those people that say, well, I'm not a video gamer, I don't understand video games. You might say, well, I understand you don't get video games, but you do have a weekly bridge group you get together with, or you play bunco, or whatever it is. You do understand the concept of play and games, and video games are just one avenue that connect people through gaming. You just don't have to have a deck of cards. You can connect with a computer or with a phone. But the concept of getting together and experiencing plays is a commonality that we've shared across all of humanity for, millennia. So I think first to just make it relatable, and then also, especially with dealing with older people, to say, look, I understand you might not get it, but you might have a grandchild, a great-grandchild, and they're playing Minecraft, and they're playing Roblox, and they're playing Candy Crush. And, don't you wish that you could kind of understand their language a little bit more? And wouldn't it be neat if we as the church, which is one of the most beautiful things the church has always been, is being a bridge builder across those generational gaps. Like, there are very few places in culture and society where like we gather so many people of different generations, and we can be the bridge builders that bridge those gaps in the generations, if we're willing to be open to it. Which also then I think means for those gamers to, wouldn't it be interesting to listen to some of the stories of people in their non-video gaming experiences? So that's my perspective on dealing with folks who did not grow up with, post-Pong era.
Well, even then, the people who were then, they were fed this lies that video games were these satanic things that people, from the time that there were Mortal Kombat. Oh, true, heaven forbid, true. The Mortal Kombat pixel, blood. Ooh, it's going to, turn the children into violent monsters. Brian, what are your thoughts to navigate those people that kind of have maybe a misunderstanding of what it looks like?
Yeah, I think, one of the big things here is just, we've talked about this before. One of the reasons that our group exists is meeting people where they're at, right? Kids today are into video games. I mentioned that before, like almost every kid is into video games. And, if we're just as a church completely missing that aspect, like we're just not able to talk to kids, about this particular thing, like we just can't engage with them at all, that makes us, just much less effective in our outreach, right? It's just like a gaping hole that's out there of like, there's a real opportunity to engage with that aspect of culture and with that interest that our kids have. And if we're not there, then they're going to engage with that without us. And so I think it's important to just like, hey, this is an area where we can get plugged in and we can, help provide that guidance, that maybe is missing, and help kids, understand their world and engage with them as a church effectively in this area. So I think, it's just, we don't want to be missing that aspect completely.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and it's something that we, really need to look at. We need to not avoid. I think that's the biggest thing is churches, youth pastors, all that should never be afraid to think outside the box. Like, think about the potential harm and think what could come of it and how you're going to deal with that. That's fine on one end. But on the other side, be ready to go outside the box. Be ready to think bigger and to do things, that maybe previous people or didn't even think about. That's always an important one. As we kind of close out our conversation in this podcast, and we hope that this conversation is useful to you, hopefully some of you out there listening are youth pastors or are interested in this idea or trying to figure out what this looks like. But how can churches leverage streaming and content creation aspects of gaming to reach a wider audience and share this message? And I'd like to tie that back into what we're doing here. But David, what are your thoughts on that?
All right. So say the question again. How can churches leverage content?
Streaming and content creation aspects of gaming. So YouTube videos, podcasts, Twitch streaming, all that stuff. Why should a youth pastor who's listening right now, who's thinking about diving into changing up, maybe going into helping, bridge that gap, do some sermons, what are ways and things that are out there available to them?
Sure. Well, as always, I've got kind of a side answer to your question. The first thing I heard in what you were saying was almost more like, what can the church learn from gaming culture? Like, and I was thinking, especially when the pandemic hit and every pastor, out there was trying to figure out, how do I live stream while engaging with a congregation? How do I make this connection? And like the world of video gaming and live streaming said, we do this. I mean, this is what we do through Twitch or through YouTube Live. Like, we live stream content and we create content for an audience. And those audience members many times live engage with the content. Like, we are telling stories, we are connecting with people. So I think there's a lot that the church can learn from the methods that gaming culture has done. But then I think in terms of content creation, to try and create content about games, I would just say, anything that you can do, if you're working with youth or young people, anything that you can do to try to connect with the stories that they will know and love, and this is what the church has always been, is to try to be relatable to the context that they're living in, right? When I was a pastor in a tiny rural town, I had to try to relate to people who lived on farms and ranches. And I had to know that when I was talking about Jesus giving shepherding metaphors, I was speaking to a congregation that actually had shepherds in it, right? So I had to be a little bit more careful about my shepherd metaphors. The same thing is true when you're talking to a congregation of gamers. We can't just BS our way through this. We have to actually experience it. We have to live it. We have to lean on those people who do have experience and say, hey, you've got experience. How do you reach these people? I had this experience, last story, and then I'll hand it over. At the church I'm at right now, we've got an alternative school across the street. This is a school of kids who need a second chance. They need a little extra help. Some of them are struggling with addiction or homelessness, or maybe just learning deficits, and many of them are the more struggling kids, and as such have problematic behaviors and things like that. And I don't really know how to interact with those kids the best way. But I recently had a conversation with a gentleman who is living in temporary housing, experiencing homelessness. And I said, I'm just struggling with figuring out how to reach these kids. And he said, man, I was one of these kids. Let me tell you what it's like. Let me tell you what it takes. And only because I had that conversation could I understand how to reach these kids at this school. So I think the same is true for gamers. If we're willing to dive in and understand and become gamers ourselves, those of you out there who aren't gamers, pick up Minecraft, go try it. If we're willing to become gamers ourselves, I think it opens a whole world of connection that we might not otherwise find possible.
Brian, what are your thoughts on that question overall?
Yeah. In terms of, engaging with sort of modern media and streaming, I think it's important to call out that, you don't need to become a Twitch streamer, right? I think that there's this daunting, there's this daunting task of now I have to do everything. And it's no, you don't have to do that. You might want to engage in terms of maybe check out some Twitch streams and figure out what it's about, so you have some context to have some conversations about hey, who's your favorite streamer, or what games do you like watching on stream or whatever. You want to be able to engage with that, but you don't necessarily need to suddenly become a media expert, right? And I think one of the things also that David mentioned was looking for other folks that are already doing that, in terms of oh, hey, here's a Twitch stream that I know of that is run by, Methodist gamers or whatever. If you have those resources on hand, and maybe you can say, hey, check out this Twitch stream if you're into games and, you're also kind of interested in the faith aspect. And maybe, you want to get them plugged into some of the communities like ours, where they can engage with both faith and gaming. I think that's really powerful. But I just want to be reassuring of man, you don't need to be an expert gamer. You don't need to be a Twitch streamer. You can just be a youth pastor, and you can still engage in a really effective way. Just make sure you know what's out there. I think that's the main thing that I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, to tie that back in with everything that we have going on, what we are and what's going on. So, we have obviously tons of podcast resources, whether that's what does it look like for your kids to play games? What type of games should my kid be playing? What should I know about video games? We have that. We have just a ton of different resources for that. We obviously have our Twitch streams that we do, on a weekly basis. If you want to get plugged in, ask questions, kind of see what it's all about, see what your kids are into type of thing. That's always available. There's just so many different resources out there. Use YouTube to look up these different things. They're everywhere. Use Twitch. Figure out, and it doesn't have to be religious based. I mean, if you just want to find out more about gaming culture, there's just so much available out there. So really leverage the information and ability to find that information out. If you're interested in kind of going down this path and kind of learning about it, you don't have to be a pro. You don't have to be like this long time gamer. There's so many different types of gamers. Honestly, kids just, I think when they find out that an adult is interested in games at all or even knows anything about their gaming culture, they usually are pretty impressed. Like, you don't have to act like you know more than you do. Sometimes they're fine with you saying, like, I'm an old person. I don't know everything, but I heard this thing about, Fortnite. Is that true? Like, is it what you say it is? And, I think they understand that, and they really appreciate that you're taking the time to get to understand who they are, what they are, kind of what all is going on with that. So I absolutely think, check out all the podcasts we have available. Make sure you guys are following us. If you want to join our Discord, join that. You can have a good conversation with other adults, other kids, to kind of figure out what's going on, what's happening. We're always available, to be a resource if you have questions about what I should do in this situation. We've had a number of churches reach out to us in the past through, private messages or anything like that to say, hey, I'm trying to do this new thing. I'd love to get your guys' advice. I see you guys are doing it. What would you recommend? Those are all things that we do on a regular basis. So to kind of just conclude this conversation, I would say really look into this, dive in deep. There's no wrong answer, and have fun while you're doing it is really all I can say, because there's a reason that we all play games, and it's because we enjoy it and have a lot of fun. Any last words that you guys want on this topic as we close out here?
Yeah. One of the other things I want to point out too is I think it would, if you're in youth ministry, I think it really behooves you to be willing to try stuff. And David mentioned earlier, like, hey, try Minecraft. And my suggestion would be, hey, actually, what'd be great is to have the kids show you how to play Minecraft. If you're not like into Minecraft or you haven't played it, have them. This is a great way to get them to engage. Is like, hey, why don't you show me how to play this game? I haven't played this game. Why, maybe you can, give me some tips and like start to walk me through it. I would love to try, and just be willing to try stuff. And hey, it might not be your cup of tea. You might be terrible at it. That's okay. You have to be kind of willing to just laugh it off and be like, no, I guess I'm just terrible at this game, but at least I gave it a shot, and it was a fun thing for me to engage with the kids with. So I think just being willing to do that is a huge step.
Yeah, and I think my last thing would just be similar to that, but and I'm even going to broaden it even more. I think that as a society, we will benefit from being interested in what other people are interested in, right? To come to one another with generous curiosity and say, I understand that you like this totally different thing, right? I understand you're super into country music. I've never really understood country music. Tell me what you love about country music. And I think the same thing is true about gamers. The same thing is true about nerds. The same thing is true about scientists and Republicans and Democrats. And it doesn't matter who you are, but I think you will benefit from being generously curious and genuinely curious about other people. And especially for people working with youth and young adults to say, hey, I understand that you guys like a bunch of YouTubers. And for young people, YouTube celebrities are the same as, our movie stars and celebrity athletes that we grew up with. I remember playing a game with the kids one time, and we all pulled out names of famous people, and I'm thinking, Brad Pitt. People going, I have no idea who that is. And they pulled out, Mr. Beast, and at the time I had no idea who Mr. Beast was. So, but we got to know each other by being genuinely curious about each other. So my advice would just be genuine, generously and genuinely curious. And I think it'll go a long way for a better society.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, and you guys made some great points there. So that's going to wrap it up for us today. Appreciate you guys joining us. And again, remember, we have so many resources out there. So feel free to not only check those out, but feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to us through our Discord. There is also a contact me page on our website, crossfirecast.com, if you're interested in going through there. But again, we appreciate you so much for joining us today. We will talk to you guys later and on our next podcast. And until then, God bless, and we will see you next time.